The sun hung merciless in the cloudless sky above Cedar Ridge, a town that seemed to exist solely through stubborn will against the harsh New Mexico territory. It was August of 1873, and the heat shimmered off the packed dirt street like water that would never come. Margaret Sullivan stood in the doorway of her ramshackle cabin on the edge of town, watching her 4-year-old son Thomas draw patterns in the dust with a stick. The boy's clothes hung loose on his thin frame, patched so many times the original fabric was barely visible. Margaret's own dress, once blue, had faded to the color of a winter sky. She was 23, though the mirror, when she dared look, showed a woman who might have been 30. Her husband James had been dead 14 months now, crushed beneath a wagon wheel at the lumber mill. The meager savings they'd accumulated vanished with his burial, and the townspeople's charity had long since dried up like everything else in this God-forsaken place. Through the heat haze, she watched the respectable women of Cedar Ridge hurry past without acknowledging her presence. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, deliberately crossed to the other side of the street, pulling her skirts close as if poverty might be contagious. Margaret had grown accustomed to their whispers, how she took in washing from the saloon girls, how she'd been seen speaking to the Mexican traders, how she was too young and too pretty to remain a widow for long without inviting trouble. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. 3 riders approached from the north, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the still air. The man in the lead sat his mount like he owned the very ground it walked on, even from a distance. Margaret recognized Samuel Brennan, owner of the Double B Ranch that sprawled across 40,000 acres of prime grazing land. His silver conchos caught the sunlight, and his black hat cast a shadow over weathered features that spoke of 50 hard years. Brennan dismounted in front of the general store, his spurs ringing against the wooden sidewalk. Margaret turned to go inside, but something made her pause. The rancher's gaze had found her across the dusty street, and in it was an assessment that made her skin prickle with unease. That evening, as Margaret bent over the washing tub behind her cabin, her hands raw from lye soap, she heard footsteps approaching. Sheriff Watson stood there, his badge glinting in the dying light, twisting his hat in his hands. "Evening, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Mr. Brennan would like a word with you. Asked me to extend an invitation to supper at the hotel." Margaret's hands stilled in the soapy water. "I have nothing proper to wear to such a place, Sheriff, and my son. Mr. Brennan said to tell you the boy's welcome too, and ma'am." Watson shifted uncomfortably. "He said to tell you he's not a man who takes no for an answer." The Imperial Hotel's dining room was a world apart from anything Margaret had known since James died. Crystal glasses caught the lamplight, and the smell of beef and fresh bread made Thomas's eyes go wide. Brennan sat across from them, cutting his steak with precise movements, while Margaret tried to keep her son from grabbing at everything on the table. "Your boy needs a father," Brennan said without preamble. "You need a home. I need a wife to run my household." He set down his knife and fork, fixing her with pale blue eyes. "I'm not a young man, Mrs. Sullivan, and I'm not given to romantic notions, but I can offer you security. The boy will have the best education money can buy. You'll have servants, fine clothes, everything a woman could want." Margaret's throat felt dry despite the water she'd just sipped. "Mr. Brennan, I know what they say about me," he interrupted. "That my first wife died young, that the second ran off, but you're not in a position to be particular, are you?" His gaze traveled over her mended dress, lingered on Thomas's patched shirt. "I spoke to Henderson at the bank. You're 3 months behind on the cabin rental. Come winter, where will you be?" The food turned to ash in Margaret's mouth. Through the window, she could see the good women of Cedar Ridge passing by, their face turned away. She thought of the coming winter, of Thomas shivering in their drafty cabin, of the empty pantry, and the pitying looks that cut deeper than contempt. What would you expect of me?" she asked quietly. Brennan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "A wife's duties," Nothing more, nothing less. I'll have my lawyer draw up papers. A proper arrangement, all legal. I'm prepared to be generous, $500 to clear your debts and set you up proper. Consider it a business transaction. $500. More money than she'd see in 5 years of taking in washing. Margaret looked at Thomas, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder, his small hand clutching a piece of bread. "When?" she whispered. "Saturday. 3 days hence. That'll give you time to prepare." Brennan signaled for the check. "The sheriff will escort you to the ranch after the ceremony." Word spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. The rancher paid for a bride, they whispered in the mercantile. At the church, in the saloon. Some called it practical, others scandalous. Margaret kept her head high as she walked through town. Though inside she felt something dying, perhaps hope, perhaps the last remnant of the girl who'd believed in love when James was alive. Saturday dawned bright and merciless. Margaret stood in her cabin, wearing the new dress Brennan had sent, gray silk that felt like chains against her skin. Thomas played at her feet, unaware that their life was about to change forever. A knock at the door made her jump. Mrs. Watson, the sheriff's wife, entered with a small bouquet of desert flowers. "Thought you might want these," she said kindly, though her eyes held pity. Every bride should have flowers. The ceremony was held in the courthouse, Judge Morrison presiding with obvious discomfort. Brennan stood rigid in his black suit, checking his pocket watch twice during the short proceedings. The only witnesses were Sheriff Watson and Brennan's foreman, Jake Holloway, a man whose scarred face never changed expression. "Do you, Margaret Sullivan, take this man?" The words washed over her like dust. She heard herself say, "I do," felt the cold weight of the ring Brennan slipped onto her finger. When told to kiss the bride, he pressed dry lips briefly to her cheek. A business transaction sealed. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Some women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs, though Margaret couldn't tell if they wept for romance or tragedy. She heard the whispers clearly. Bought and paid for. What choice did she have? That poor child. As the wagon carried them toward the Double B Ranch, Thomas asleep in her lap, Margaret watched Cedar Ridge disappear behind them. Brennan rode ahead, talking business with his foreman, already seeming to forget the woman he'd just married. The wedding ring cut into her finger, too tight, like everything about this new life promised to be. The sun was setting by the time they reached the ranch house, a sprawling adobe structure that looked more like a fortress than a home. Servants lined up to greet them, Mexican and Indian women who kept their eyes downcast. A Chinese cook who nodded silently. Margaret understood their caution. She was just another in a line of Mrs. Brennans, and they'd learn not to grow attached. That night, as she tucked Thomas into a bed larger than their entire cabin had been, Margaret stood at the window overlooking the vast Brennan empire. Somewhere in the darkness, coyotes howled, and she wondered if they were mourning with her for the life she'd just traded away, for the freedom she'd sold for $500 and a gray silk dress that would never fit quite right. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 10. Margaret stood before the massive oak door of the master bedroom, her hands trembling against the silk of her nightgown. Another gift from Brennan, white as snow and cold as winter. Through the door, she could hear the clink of glass, smell the acrid smoke of his cigars. "Come in," his voice called before she could knock. "A wife doesn't need permission to enter her husband's room." The bedroom was vast, dominated by a 4-poster bed that looked like it could swallow her whole. Brennan sat in a leather chair by the fireplace, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand. He'd removed his jacket and vest, but still wore his boots, as if ready to conduct business even now. "You look well in that gown," he said, appraising her like livestock at auction. "Cost me $40 in Santa Fe. The shopkeeper assured me it was the finest French silk." Margaret remained by the door, unsure whether to move forward or flee. "Thomas is sleeping well in his new room. He's never had such a fine... The boy's not my concern right now." Brennan set down his glass and stood, crossing to her with deliberate steps. You understand what you're here for, don't you? I didn't pay $500 for a housekeeper. I have plenty of those." The words hit her like physical blows. She forced herself to remain still as he circled her, his eyes calculating. "Turn around," he commanded. When she hesitated, his voice hardened. "I said turn around. Let me see what I've purchased." Margaret turned slowly, bile rising in her throat. She could feel his gaze traveling over her like dirty hands, evaluating his investment. "You'll do," he said finally. "My first wife, Catherine, was prettier, but she was weak, died in childbirth. The second, Maria, had spirit, too much spirit, ran off with a traveling merchant." He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "But you're practical, desperate. That's better than pretty or spirited. Desperate women don't run." He moved closer, and Margaret could smell the whiskey on his breath, see the possession in his eyes. This wasn't a husband approaching his wife. This was a man claiming property he'd bought and paid for. When he reached for her, something inside Margaret snapped. She thought of Thomas, of the promises she'd made to James on his deathbed, of the woman she'd been before poverty ground her down. His hands on her shoulders felt like shackles, and she understood with crystal clarity that she'd traded one form of starvation for another. The night passed in a blur of humiliation and endurance. Brennan took what he'd paid for with the same methodical precision he applied to breeding cattle. When it was over, he returned to his whiskey and cigars, dismissing her with a wave. "You can sleep in your own room," he said without looking at her. "I'll send for you when I have need." Margaret gathered her nightgown and fled, her bare feet silent on the cold tile floors. In her room, a space adjoining Thomas's that was larger than their entire cabin, she collapsed against the door and wept silently, her body shaking with rage and shame. Through the window, she could see the vast expanse of Brennan land stretching to the horizon, and it felt like a prison with no walls. Dawn came without sleep. Margaret rose, washed the night from her skin with water so hot it burned, and dressed in one of the simple day dresses Brennan had provided. When she entered the dining room, he was already there, reading correspondence while consuming eggs and beef. "You'll take breakfast in your room going forward," he said without looking up. "I don't care for conversation in the morning. The housekeeper, Mrs. Rollins, will explain your duties." Mrs. Rollins was a severe woman of 60, her gray hair pulled back so tightly it stretched her features. She led Margaret through the house with military efficiency, pointing out responsibilities with obvious disdain. "Mr. Brennan expects the household to run smoothly," she said, her accent marking her as originally from somewhere back east. "You'll oversee the domestic staff, plan menus with cook, and ensure the house is presentable for his business associates." She paused at the door to the study. "You're not to enter here without permission. Mr. Brennan is particular about his privacy." "I understand," Margaret said quietly. Mrs. Rollins' expression softened slightly. "A word of advice. Mrs. Brennan, the less trouble you cause, the less attention he'll pay you. That's how one survives in this house." As the days passed, Margaret learned the truth of those words. Brennan treated her with the same detached ownership he showed his cattle and horses. She was summoned to his room twice more that week, each time a transaction as cold and commercial as their wedding had been. During the days, she moved through the house like a ghost, overseeing staff who regarded her with a mixture of pity and caution. Thomas, at least, thrived in his new surroundings. The cook, a kind man named Chen Lu, had taken a liking to the boy and kept him supplied with treats. But even her son's happiness felt tainted, bought with her degradation. One afternoon, Margaret overheard two of the ranch hands talking near the kitchen garden. "Heard the boss telling Holloway he got a bargain," one said. "Cheaper than bringing in a woman from the fancy houses in San Francisco, and more respectable looking for when the territorial officials visit. That's our Mr. Brennan," the other laughed. "Never makes a deal unless the numbers work in his favor." Margaret's hands clenched around the basket of vegetables she'd been gathering. She thought of the women in Cedar Ridge calling her the bride he paid for, but even they didn't know the full truth of it. She wasn't a wife, she was a purchase, a business expense, a thing to be used and displayed as needed. That night, as she prepared for another summons that didn't come, Margaret stood at her window and stared out at the darkness. Somewhere beyond the ranch boundaries was freedom, but where could a woman alone with a child go? She had no money. Brennan had paid her debts directly, leaving her with nothing. She had no family, no friends who would take her in. But as she watched the stars wheel overhead, a dangerous thought took root. She'd survived poverty, survived widowhood, survived the shame of being bought. Perhaps she could survive escape too. In the drawer of her dresser, she began to secret away small things. A few coins that fell from Brennan's pockets, bits of food that would keep, a map she'd found in the library. The house slept around her, this luxurious prison with its silk sheets and crystal glasses. Mrs. Rollins was right that causing no trouble meant being left alone, but Margaret was beginning to think there were worse things than trouble. She thought of Maria, Brennan's second wife, who'd run off with a merchant. They called her weak for running, but maybe she'd been the strongest of them all. In his room down the hall, she could hear Brennan snoring, secure in his ownership, confident in her desperation. He'd bought himself a bride, paid good money for her, and believed that made her his forever. But Margaret Sullivan Brennan was learning that some things couldn't be bought, and dignity, once lost, might still be found again, somewhere beyond the boundaries of the Double B Ranch. The moon was new, leaving the desert in perfect darkness as Margaret crept from her room. 3 weeks of planning had led to this moment. In her canvas bag, she carried dried meat, hardtack biscuits, 2 canteens of water, and the $37 she'd managed to gather, coins forgotten in Brennan's study, bills slipped from household funds meant for supplies. Thomas, wrapped in a blanket, clung to her neck, his trust absolute even in their flight. She'd chosen tonight carefully. Brennan had ridden to Tucson on business, taking most of his men with him. Only a skeleton crew remained, and she'd heard them drinking in the bunkhouse earlier, celebrating their boss's absence. The horses would be her biggest challenge. She couldn't risk the noise of saddling one. They would have to walk, at least until they reached the trading post 15 miles south. The kitchen door creaked softly as she slipped out. The night air was cool, a blessing after the suffocating days. Margaret had memorized the route during her weeks of afternoon walks, always careful to appear as nothing more than a bored wife taking constitutionals. South to Skeleton Creek, then follow it west toward the mountains where the old Apache trails began. They'd covered perhaps 3 miles when Thomas began to whimper. "Hush, sweet boy," she whispered, shifting his weight. "We're going on an adventure, remember? Like the stories I tell you." But the child was tired, confused by their midnight journey. His cries, though muffled against her shoulder, seemed to echo in the desert silence. Margaret pressed on, her feet already burning in the thin boots, fear driving her forward. Every shadow could be pursuit. Every sound might herald discovery. By dawn, they'd reached the edge of Brennan's property. Margaret allowed herself a moment of hope as she crossed the invisible boundary marked only by a broken fence post. Beyond lay scrub desert, harsh and unforgiving, but free. She found shelter beneath a cluster of Palo Verde trees and gave Thomas water and a piece of dried meat. "Where we going, Mama?" he asked, his young face dusty and confused. "Somewhere safe, my love. Somewhere we can be ourselves again." But the desert had other plans. By midday, the sun blazed overhead like a furnace. Margaret had underestimated how quickly their water would disappear, how the heat would sap their strength. Thomas grew listless, his lips cracking. Her own throat felt like sand. The trading post still lay miles distant, and she could no longer carry her son's weight. They stumbled into a dry wash, seeking shade beneath a limestone overhang. Margaret's hands shook as she gave Thomas the last of their water, keeping none for herself. She'd failed. In trying to save them from one prison, she'd led them to die in another. Closing her eyes, she prayed, not for salvation, but for forgiveness. The sound came first. Horses' hooves on stone, voices calling in a language she didn't recognize. Margaret pressed Thomas against her, prepared to face Brennan's men, to beg for her son's life if not her own. But the riders who appeared at the wash's edge weren't cowboys. 5 Apache warriors sat their ponies, faces painted with white clay and charcoal, rifles balanced across their saddles. Margaret had heard the stories: settlers killed, women taken, children raised as Apache. Terror froze her blood, but beneath it, a strange thought. Would their captivity be any worse than Brennan's? The warriors spoke among themselves in rapid Apache. One, older, with gray threading his long hair, gestured toward them with his rifle. Another, perhaps seeing her condition, threw a water skin at her feet. Margaret grabbed it desperately, helping Thomas drink before taking a small sip herself. The youngest warrior dismounted. He couldn't have been more than 25, with intelligent dark eyes that studied them without the hostility she expected. His face bore scars, 3 parallel lines across his left cheek. But when Thomas whimpered, something in his expression shifted. He said something to his companions that sparked an argument. The older warrior gestured angrily, pointing back the way they'd come. Margaret understood without words. They were debating her fate. The young warrior's voice rose, authoritative despite his youth. Finally, the older man spat in the dust and turned his horse away. The young Apache approached slowly, as one might approach a frightened animal. He pointed to himself. "Kuruk," he said, then gestured to her. "Margaret," she managed through cracked lips. "My son, Thomas." Kuruk nodded, then spoke in broken English. "You come. No hurt." He pointed to the horse. "Woman sick, child sick. You die here." Margaret had no choice. When Kuruk lifted Thomas onto his horse, her son didn't resist, too weak to fear. The warrior helped her mount behind them, her arms encircling both her child and this strange savior. The other Apache watched with obvious disapproval, but followed Kuruk's lead. They rode for hours through terrain Margaret could never have navigated alone. The Apache knew every hidden spring, every secret path through the ridges and canyons. As the sun began to sink, they descended into a valley where smoke rose from a cluster of wickiups, dome-shaped dwellings made of bent branches and grass. The camp erupted at their arrival. Women and children emerged, voices rising in alarm at the sight of white captives. An elderly woman, clearly a figure of authority, approached Kuruk with sharp words. He dismounted and replied calmly, gesturing to Margaret and Thomas. Margaret understood she was the subject of intense debate. Some Apache pointed back toward Brennan's ranch, making throat-cutting gestures. Others seemed to argue for simply abandoning them. But Kuruk stood firm, and when he lifted Thomas from the horse, the boy's pitiful appearance seemed to soften some hearts. The elderly woman, Kuruk called her Nalin, finally nodded. She barked orders, and 2 younger women reluctantly approached. They led Margaret to a small wickiup set apart from the others, clearly meant for prisoners or guests of uncertain status. Inside, buffalo robes covered the ground, and baskets held water and what looked like dried agave. Kuruk appeared at the entrance as Margaret tended to Thomas. He carried a pottery bowl filled with a thin gruel that smelled of mesquite and something medicinal. "For boy," he said, demonstrating how to feed it slowly. "Make strong." "Why?" Margaret asked, the first word she'd spoken since giving her name. "Why help us?" Kuruk was silent for a moment, his scarred face unreadable. Then he pointed to Thomas. "I have sister. Soldiers take. She's small, like him." His English faltered, but his meaning was clear. "Maybe dead now. Maybe slave. I no let child die in desert." He left before Margaret could respond. Through the wickiup's opening, she could see the camp settling for night. The Apache moved with easy familiarity. Families gathering around cook fires, children playing despite the harsh life. It was a community. She realized, not unlike Cedar Ridge in its way, people surviving together against an unforgiving land. Thomas stirred in her arms, the medicinal gruel already bringing color back to his cheeks. Margaret held him close, aware of the profound irony. She'd fled one captor only to fall into the hands of those society deemed savage. Yet Kuruk had shown more humanity in one afternoon than Brennan had in 3 weeks of marriage. Outside, she could hear the Apaches singing, a low, rhythmic chant that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Guards had been posted around their wickiup. She could see their shadows in the firelight. They were prisoners, no doubt about that. The Apache had their own justice, their own reasons for keeping white captives. But as Margaret lay back on the buffalo robes, her son breathing steadily beside her, she felt something she hadn't experienced since James died. Not safety, that was too much to hope for, but possibility. In Brennan's house, she'd known exactly what each day would bring: degradation, ownership, slow death of the spirit. Here, among people she'd been taught to fear, the future was uncertain. Uncertain was better than hopeless. Through the smoke hole above, stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere beyond this hidden valley, Brennan would soon discover their escape. He would rage, would send men to track them. The Apache knew this too. She'd seen it in their urgent debates. Her presence here put them at risk. Yet Kuruk had chosen to help, had stood against his own people to save a white woman and child from the desert. Margaret didn't understand why, but she understood debt. Whatever came next, whatever price the Apache demanded for their reluctant mercy, it couldn't be worse than what she'd fled. In the distance, a coyote howled, answered by another. The sound no longer seemed mournful to Margaret. Instead, it spoke of survival, of creatures that endured despite every attempt to eliminate them. Like the Apache, like her, she closed her eyes, Thomas safe in her arms, and let the Apache singing carry her towards sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, but tonight, for the first time in weeks, she had chosen her own fate. Even if that choice had led her into the hands of those the world called savage, it was still hers. The bride Brennan had paid for was gone. What Margaret would become in this Apache camp remained to be seen, but it would be of her own making. The first days in the Apache camp passed in a blur of suspicion and small kindnesses. Margaret learned that trust was earned in droplets, not rivers. The women who brought food to their wickiup would not meet her eyes, setting down baskets of pine nuts and dried venison before retreating quickly. Children peered at them from behind their mothers' skirts, fascinated and fearful of the pale-skinned strangers. Kuruk came each morning to check on Thomas, bringing medicinal teas that smelled of sage and something bitter. He taught Margaret a few Apache words: gohe for coffee, tu for water, shash for bear. The last made Thomas giggle, the first genuine joy she'd heard from him since their flight. On the 4th day, Nayland entered their wickiup with 2 younger women. The elderly matriarch studied Margaret with sharp black eyes that missed nothing, then spoke at length in Apache, one of the younger women, who Kuruk had identified as Ayanna, translated in halting English. She says you cannot stay here doing nothing. Apache women work, you eat. You teach, we protect. Teach? Margaret asked. What could I teach? Ayanna conferred with Nalin, then replied, white man's marks. She made writing motions. Some here want to learn. No enemy's signs. Margaret nodded quickly. Yes, I can teach letters, numbers. I taught school before. She stopped, realizing these women cared nothing for her past life. Nayland seemed satisfied. She pointed to Margaret's soft hands, clearly disapproving. Then to the cook fires outside. The message was clear: earn your keep or leave. That afternoon, Margaret found herself grinding mesquite pods alongside Apache women who watched her fumbling efforts with barely concealed disdain. Her hands, already blistered from their desert flight, soon bled from the rough stone tools, but she persisted. Understanding this was a test. When young Ayanna showed her how to hold the grinding stone properly, Margaret accepted the correction gratefully. As the days became a week, the camp's rhythms revealed themselves. The Apache rose with dawn, the men departing to hunt or scout while women tended fires, prepared food, and crafted baskets so tightly woven they could hold water. Children ran free but under watchful eyes, their games teaching skills they'd need to survive. Karuk often stopped by in the evenings, bringing small gifts for Thomas: a carved wooden horse, a handful of bright pebbles, once a young rabbit he'd caught alive. The boy, resilient as only children could be, began following the warrior with adoring eyes. Margaret watched their growing bond with mixed emotions. "Your son learns quick," Karuk said one evening, sitting cross-legged outside their wickiup. He'd been teaching Thomas to track small animals in the dust. "Could be good hunter someday." "He's all I have," Margaret replied, watching Thomas play with Apache boys near the fire. They'd accepted him more readily than their mothers had accepted her. "No," Karuk corrected gently. "You have choices, not like—" He paused, searching for words. "Not like my sister had." It was the most he'd spoken of his sister since that first day. Margaret waited, having learned that silence often brought more words than questions. "Soldiers come 3 winters ago," he continued, his scarred face hard in the firelight. "Say we raid settlements. Not true, was Chiricahua banned. Not us, but all Apache, same to White Eyes." His hands clenched. "They take young ones for boarding school. Say make them civilized. My sister, Diani, she 12 winters. They cut her hair, take her name, beat her for speaking Apache words." Margaret's throat tightened. She'd heard of the boarding schools, places where Indian children were forced to abandon their heritage. Is she still there? She run away. They catch, she run again. Karuk's voice dropped. "Last time, they send letter. Say she's sick with white man's coughing disease. Say she die. But no body to bury, no ceremony for spirit journey." He looked at Thomas playing in the dust. "When I see your boy in desert, I think of Diani. Think maybe her spirit send me to save him." The confession hung between them, bridging worlds in shared grief. Margaret understood then why Karuk had risked his standing to save them, not from kindness alone, but from a wound that wouldn't heal. As the second week began, tensions in the camp shifted. Scouts reported increased military patrols, ranchers hiring more guns. The Apache held council each night, voices raised in argument. Margaret couldn't understand the words, but she recognized the glances thrown her way. One morning, Chaitin, the gray-haired warrior who'd wanted to leave them in the desert, confronted Karuk near the horse pen. Their argument drew a crowd, with Chaitin gesturing angrily toward Margaret and speaking of Inda, which she'd learned meant White Eyes, or enemies. Karuk stood firm, his own voice rising, but Margaret could see the community dividing. That evening, Nayland summoned her. The old woman's wickiup smelled of herbs and smoke, decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the firelight. Through Ayana's translation, Nayland delivered her judgment. "You bring danger to our people. This is true, but Karuk speaks for you. Says you different from other whites. Says you have Apache heart, wounded but strong." Nayland studied Margaret's face. "You prove this. You stay. You fail. You go." "How do I prove it?" Margaret asked. Nayland smiled, showing missing teeth. "Life proves. Every day. Every choice. We watch." The test came sooner than expected. 3 days later, while Margaret helped to prepare the evening meal, riders approached the camp. 2 Apache scouts supporting a third who slumped in his saddle. Blood soaked through his shirt from a bullet wound in his shoulder. The camp erupted in activity. Women cleared a wickiup while men gathered, faces grim. The wounded warrior was barely older than Karuk, his face gray with pain and blood loss. Nayland took charge, but Margaret could see the uncertainty in her movements. The bullet needed to come out, but their healer had died last winter. "I can help," Margaret said suddenly, surprising herself. My first husband, was injured at the mill. I watched the doctor, learned some things." Ayana translated rapidly. Nayland's eyes narrowed, weighing risks. Finally, she nodded and barked orders. Clean water appeared, along with a sharp knife and strips of clean hide. Margaret's hands shook as she examined the wound. The bullet had lodged deep, but missed the vital areas. She'd watched Dr. Hammond work on James, remembered his steady hands, his careful cleaning of wounds, but watching and doing were different things. "Hold him," she said, and strong hands pinned the warrior down. Margaret took a deep breath, said a prayer, and began. The bullet came free after what felt like hours, but was probably minutes. Blood flowed freely, but cleanly. Margaret packed the wound with moss Nayland provided, wrapped it tightly, and sat back on her heels, exhausted. The warrior had passed out from pain, but still breathed. Silence filled the wickiup. Then Nayland placed a gnarled hand on Margaret's shoulder, the first voluntary touch from any Apache woman. She spoke at length, and Ayanna translated with something like wonder. She says you have healing hands, says maybe you were sent here for purpose. Ayanna paused. She says you can stay. The camp's attitude shifted overnight. Women who'd ignored her now nodded in greeting. Children were allowed to approach Thomas freely. And Kuruk looked at her with something new in his dark eyes, something that made her heart beat strangely. But with acceptance came understanding. The Apache lived on a knife's edge, pushed ever further into barren lands. Their traditional hunting grounds seized by ranchers like Brennan. Every raid for supplies risked retaliation. Every interaction with whites courted disaster. Margaret began to grasp the true courage of Kuruk's decision to save them. One evening, as she watched Thomas play warrior games with Apache boys, Kuruk sat beside her. "You sorry you ran to us?" he asked. Margaret thought of Brennan's cold bed, of being property, of the life that had awaited her son in that luxurious prison. Then she looked at Thomas, laughing freely, his skin brown from sun, his eyes bright with life. "No," she said firmly. "Whatever comes, this was my choice, our choice." Kuruk nodded slowly. "Choice makes us human. White man, Apache, all same in this." He paused, then added quietly, "You brave, Margaret. Brave like Apache woman." It was the highest compliment he could give. As the stars emerged overhead and the camp settled into evening routines, Margaret felt something she'd thought lost forever. Belonging, not complete, perhaps never complete, but real nonetheless. Somewhere beyond these hidden valleys, Brennan searched for his runaway bride. The Apache knew confrontation was coming. She could see it in their increased patrols, their careful rationing. But tonight, with her son safe and her place earned through blood and courage, Margaret allowed herself a moment of peace. She'd fled civilization to find sanctuary among those deemed savage. The irony wasn't lost on her. But as Kuruk had said, choices made them human. And for the first time since James died, Margaret's choices were her own. The news arrived with a Mexican trader who sometimes dealt with the Apache, bringing ammunition and goods in exchange for hides and silver. His face was grave as he spoke to Kuruk in Spanish, gesturing repeatedly toward the east. Margaret caught fragments. "Brennan. Mucho dinero. Cazadores." Kuruk's expression darkened as he translated. "Your husband offers $500 for your return. Same price he paid. Says you stole from him." His lips twisted bitterly. "Says you his property, like horse or saddle." The traitor, Miguel, added more, his weathered face sympathetic. "Senora, he tells everyone you ran to Apache arms. The whole territory talks. They say you betray your race, that you are—" He paused delicately. "That you are no longer a respectable woman." Margaret felt the words like physical blows, but forced herself to remain steady. "What else?" "He hires hunters, not just cowboys, professional trackers, men who hunt Apache for bounty." Miguel glanced around nervously. "They come maybe 1 week, maybe less." That night, the council fire burned late. Margaret wasn't permitted to attend, but she could hear the raised voices, the angry debates. Chayton's voice rose above the others, and she didn't need translation to understand his message. "Cast out the white woman before she brings destruction." Kuruk argued fiercely, but Margaret could hear the tide turning against him. Why should the band risk everything for one white woman and her child? It was logical, practical. It was exactly what she would have counseled in their place. Near midnight, Kuruk appeared at her wickiup, his face drawn. "Council speaks tomorrow. Many say you must go." "And you?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. "I say you Apache now. Save Nashota's life. Work beside our women. Teach our children white man's writing." He paused, struggling with words. "But I am one voice." Margaret looked at Thomas, sleeping peacefully on his buffalo robe. These weeks had transformed him from a pale, frightened child to one who ran laughing through the camp. Brown and healthy, the thought of returning him to Brennan's world made her stomach clench. "If they decide we must go, where would we go?" she asked quietly. Karuk was silent for a long moment. "I know place. Hidden Canyon, 2 days north. Sacred place, but safe. I take you there. You would defy your people for us?" His dark eyes met hers steadily. Already defy once, in desert. Nothing changed. The weight of his words settled over her. This man, who owed her nothing, who had every reason to hate all whites, would risk exile for her. Margaret felt tears threaten but forced them back. Apache women didn't cry over hardships. Mourning brought unexpected allies. Nayland entered the council circle, something women rarely did, and spoke at length. The wounded warrior Margaret had saved, Nashota, limped in on a crutch and added his voice. Even Ayanna stood and spoke, her usually quiet demeanor replaced by passionate argument. But Chayton had powerful words too. He spoke of massacres, of broken treaties, of Apache children stolen for boarding schools. He pointed east toward Brennan's realm and spoke of the violence that would come. The council remained divided as the sun reached its peak. Then the scouts came riding hard, dust billowing from their horses' hooves. They leapt down, speaking rapidly. Karuk's face went rigid as he listened. "Hunters," he said to Margaret, "already at Willow Springs. 20 men, maybe more. They find our trail by tomorrow." The camp exploded into action. Women began packing, children gathered, warriors checked weapons, but the council hadn't decided Margaret's fate. In the chaos, Chayton confronted Karuk once more, his weathered face twisted with fury. "You see?" he spat in accented English, ensuring Margaret understood. "White woman brings death, always same." "She not same," Karuk replied firmly. "She flee white man same as us. Flee to save self, not for Apache people." Chayton's hand moved to his knife. "I say we give her to hunters. Save our people." Karuk stepped between Chayton and Margaret, his own hand near his weapon. The camp seemed to hold its breath. Then Nayland's voice cracked like a whip. The old woman strode forward, placing herself in the middle of the confrontation. She spoke in rapid Apache, gesturing to Margaret, to Thomas playing with Apache children, to Nashota standing alive because of white woman's medicine. Then she said something that made several warriors gasp. Ayanna whispered the translation to Margaret. "She invokes the law of sanctuary, says Margaret earned protection through blood healing, says Apache honor means nothing if we sell those who save our warriors." Chayton's face darkened further, but he stepped back. Nayland had invoked something sacred, something that even his anger couldn't override. But Margaret could see in his eyes that this wasn't over. As the band prepared to flee deeper into the mountains, Karuk found Margaret packing their few belongings. "Nalin buys time," he said quietly. "But Chayton speaks truth too. Hunters follow you, not us. Then we should leave." Margaret said firmly, "I won't have Apache blood on my hands." "No." Karuk's voice was fierce. "You earn place here. We not throw away people like white men do." That afternoon, as the band moved out, Margaret saw the dust cloud on the eastern horizon. The hunters were closer than predicted. Karuk saw it too, his jaw tightening. They were moving too slowly. Elderly, children, wounded. The hunters had fresh horses and no families to protect. At dusk, they reached a box canyon with only one entrance, defensible, but also a trap. As families set up hasty shelters, the warriors gathered. Margaret could see them checking rifles, counting ammunition. Not enough. Never enough against 20 well-armed hunters. Karuk found her helping Nalin tend the wounded Nashota. "Tonight, I take you and boy, we slip away. Draw hunters north while band goes south." "No," Margaret said. "I won't let you die for us." "Not plan to die," he replied with a grim smile. "Plan to live. With you. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Margaret felt her heart race, not from fear, but from something else entirely. This man, this Apache warrior who'd saved her from the desert, was offering more than protection. "Kuruk," she began, but he held up his hand. "No time for words. You decide. Stay. Maybe I'll die. Go with me. Maybe we live. Maybe we—" He paused, vulnerability flickering across his scarred face. "Maybe we find new life together." A shout from the canyon entrance cut through the moment. Riders approaching under a white flag. Margaret recognized the lead figure, Jake Holloway, Brennan's foreman, his cruel face visible even at distance. "Margaret Sullivan Brennan." Holloway's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "Your husband wants his property back. Come out now, and these savages live? Make us come in, and we'll paint these rocks with Apache blood." The Apache warriors bristled, weapons rising, but they were outnumbered, outgunned. Margaret could see the reality in their faces. They would fight, would die with honor, but they would die. Thomas ran to her, frightened by the shouting. As she held him, Margaret looked around the canyon, at Nalin, who'd shown her acceptance, at Nashota, alive because of her help, at the children who'd become her son's playmates, at Kuruk, who offered her something she'd never thought to have again: choice, respect, perhaps even love. She ran into an Apache's arms instead. Holloway shouted again. "That's what the whole territory's saying. Come back now, and your husband might forgive. Stay, and you'll be the woman who chose savages over her own kind." The words were meant to shame, to break her will. But as Margaret stood, Thomas in her arms, she realized they were simply truth. She had run into Apache arms, not for shameful reasons, but for freedom, for dignity, for the chance to be human rather than property. "What you choose?" Kuruk asked quietly beside her. Margaret looked into his dark eyes and saw her answer reflected there. Whatever came next, flight or fight, life or death, she would face it as herself, not as Brennan's purchased bride. "I choose freedom," she said. "I choose you." The canyon held its breath, waiting for her next words, the words that would determine whether blood would flow or whether another path might open. In the gathering darkness, with hunters at the gate and her whole world hanging in balance, Margaret Sullivan Brennan prepared to speak her truth. Margaret stepped forward. Thomas clutched against her chest. The Apache warriors tensed, but Kuruk's raised hand held them back. She walked until she stood at the canyon's mouth, visible to Holloway and his men, but still within the protective circle of Apache rifles. "I'm here, Mr. Holloway," she called, her voice carrying clear across the desert evening. "But I'm not coming back." Holloway spat tobacco juice and laughed. "Now that ain't your choice to make, Mrs. Brennan. You're bought and paid for. The law's on our side." "Whose law?" Margaret asked. "The law that lets a man buy a woman like cattle? The law that drives these people from their lands?" She felt strength flowing through her, born of weeks of survival and newfound purpose. "I choose Apache law now." The hunters stirred restlessly. She could see some checking their weapons, eager for violence. But Holloway held them back, calculating. "You're talking crazy. Woman, sun's got to your brain." His voice turned harder. "But I'll make this simple. Come out now, or we're coming in, and when the smoke clears, that boy of yours might not have a mother anymore." The threat against Thomas sent rage through Margaret like wildfire. Before anyone could stop her, she'd grabbed a rifle from the nearest warrior and aimed it at Holloway. "The first man who moves toward this canyon dies," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "And it won't be Apache hands that kill him." Silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Holloway laughed again, but nervously now. "You won't shoot, good Christian woman like you. The woman you're looking for is dead." Margaret replied. "She died in Samuel Brennan's bed, sold for $500. I'm someone else now, someone who'll protect her son and these people who showed us mercy when your kind showed none." Behind her, she heard Kuruk translating her words for the Apache. A murmur ran through the warriors. Surprise, approval, growing respect. Chayton himself stepped forward, his rifle joining hers in targeting Holloway, but the foreman wasn't finished. "You think this ends here? Brennan's got the cavalry's ear. One word from him, and the army comes. These Apaches you're so fond of, they'll hang. That breed-lover warrior making eyes at you, he'll swing first." The words hit their mark. Margaret knew the truth in them. The army always sided with wealthy ranchers over Apache bands. Her defiance might doom them all. She felt her resolve wavering until Karuk's voice came soft beside her. "Let them come," he said in English, loud enough for all to hear. "Apache die free, not live as slaves. This woman, this boy, they are people now. We fight for our people." A war cry went up from the Apache warriors, fierce and primal. The hunters' horses shied nervously, and Margaret saw fear flicker across several faces. These men were used to hunting scattered, fleeing Apache families. A cornered band ready to die fighting was another matter. Holloway tried one more tactic. "Brennan said to tell you something. Margaret said he'll forgive this foolishness. Come back, and he'll treat you proper, even raise the boy as his own heir, since he's got no children." The offer hung in the air like poison. Security, wealth, position, everything she'd thought she wanted when she'd accepted Brennan's proposal. Thomas would inherit a fortune instead of growing up running from soldiers. "Mama?" Thomas whispered against her neck, feeling her tension. Margaret kissed her son's dusty hair and made her choice. "Tell Brennan he can keep his money and his forgiveness. I've found something worth more." What happened next would be debated around Apache fires for years. Some said the spirits of the canyon spoke, others credited Nalen's medicine powers. But as Holloway raised his hand to signal attack, his horse suddenly reared, screaming. The animal had stepped on a rattlesnake hidden in the rocks, or so it appeared. Holloway flew backward, his pistol discharging into the air. In the chaos, other horses spooked. 2 hunters were thrown. Apache war cries echoed off canyon walls, creating the illusion of hundreds rather than dozens. Someone among the hunters shouted about ambush, about Apache reinforcements in the rocks above. "Fall back!" one hunter yelled. "It's a trap." Holloway, struggling to his feet, tried to restore order, but darkness was falling. His men were spooked, and the Apache looked ready to charge. Military wisdom said never fight Apache in their chosen ground at night. Greed warred with survival instinct, and survival won. "This isn't over," Holloway shouted as his men retreated. "The army will hear about this. You've signed your death warrant, woman, yours and all these savages." The hunters thundered away, leaving dust and threats behind. The Apache maintained their positions until scouts confirmed the retreat was real. Then, as stars emerged overhead, something extraordinary happened. Chayton approached Margaret, his weathered face unreadable. For a long moment, they faced each other, the woman he'd wanted to cast out and the warrior who'd opposed her. Then, slowly, he placed his fist over his heart in the gesture of respect. "You speak true," he said in his broken English. "You Apache heart, I wrong about you." He glanced at Karuk. Maybe wrong about other things too. One by one, other warriors made the same gesture. Women who'd barely tolerated her presence now touched her arms, speaking words she didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear. Sister, warrior, protector. Nalen approached with something in her gnarled hands, a necklace of turquoise and silver, the mark of belonging. "You choose us," Ayana translated as Nalen placed it around Margaret's neck. "Now we choose you. No more guest, family." But even as the band celebrated their bloodless victory, Margaret knew the truth. Holloway's threats weren't empty. The army would come, drawn by Brennan's wealth and influence. The Apache had won a skirmish but invited a war. Late that night, as the camp settled, Karuk found Margaret sitting alone, watching the stars. Thomas slept nearby, exhausted by the day's terrors and triumphs. "You understand what comes?" Karuk asked, settling beside her. "Yes, I've doomed you all." "No." His voice was firm. "Doom comes anyway. Army pushes, takes land, kills our people. Slow death or fast death, what difference? He paused. But you give us something else. Pride. Show that Apache ways can touch even white heart. Show that some whites see us as human. Margaret felt tears on her cheeks. I don't know if I'm strong enough for what's coming. Karuk's hand found hers, calloused but gentle. You face down 20 hunters for your son. Stand between Apache and death. You stronger than you know. His thumb traced the turquoise at her throat. This means you one of us. My people, my fight, your fight. And if we lose? Margaret asked. If the army comes and then we lose together. Karuk interrupted. But until then, we live free, choosing our path. He turned her face toward his, eyes serious. I make you promise when I save you. Now I make another. Whatever comes, I stand with you, die with you if needed. But first, live with you. The kiss was gentle, nothing like Brennan's claiming ownership. It spoke of partnership, respect, shared courage against an uncertain future. When they parted, Margaret saw their path clear. Not easy, not safe, but theirs. We should run, she said. Tonight, take Thomas and disappear into the mountains. Karuk shook his head. Ban needs every warrior now. Every person who stands for Apache way. He smiled slightly. Besides, you're terrible at running. Always run into Apache arms instead. Despite everything, Margaret laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise them both. Here at the edge of disaster, facing the fury of her legal husband and the might of the army, she could still laugh. The Apache had given her that, the strength to find joy even in darkness. As they sat together under the vast desert sky, Margaret understood that she'd crossed more than just physical boundaries. The woman who'd stood in that Cedar Ridge doorway, desperate and defeated, was truly gone. In her place sat someone harder but also softer. Someone who'd learned that family wasn't always blood and home wasn't always safe. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Brennan wouldn't accept this humiliation. The army would mobilize. The fragile peace between this Apache band and the encroaching white world would shatter. But tonight, surrounded by her chosen people, with her son safe and a warrior's promise in her heart, Margaret Sullivan Brennan, no, just Margaret now, was exactly where she belonged. The hunters had called it right. She'd run into an Apache's arms instead. What they'd never understand was that those arms offered what Brennan's money never could, the freedom to be herself, to choose her fate, to stand with dignity, even if standing meant falling. War was coming to the desert, but for the first time in her life, Margaret would meet it on her own terms. The bullet had torn through Karuk's shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Margaret dropped to her knees beside him, her hands already working to staunch the blood flow. Around them, the battle raged. Apache warriors using the canyon's rocks for cover, while army soldiers advanced in disciplined lines. It had been 3 weeks since Holloway's retreat, 3 weeks of tense waiting, of scouts reporting army movements, of desperate preparations. When the attack came at dawn, it brought 50 soldiers and a determination to make an example of the renegade Apaches and their white captive. Go! Karuk gasped, his face gray with pain. Take Thomas, run! Never again, Margaret said fiercely, pressing torn fabric against the wound. I'm through running. She'd learned much about healing from Nayland these past weeks. The old woman had taught her which plant stopped bleeding, which eased pain, how to clean wounds with boiled water and prayer. Now Margaret worked with steady hands while bullets whined overhead like angry wasps. Ayana appeared beside her, carrying medical supplies. Together they dragged Karuk behind better cover, a cluster of boulders where other wounded had been gathered. Thomas was there too, protected by 2 elderly women who'd volunteered to guard the children. Mama, he cried, but Margaret forced herself to focus on Karuk. I'm here, baby. Stay with Grandmother Nalin. The battle was going badly. The Apache fought with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered 3-1. Chayton led a group trying to flank the soldiers but was driven back. Young Nashota, still weak from his earlier wound, fell defending the canyon entrance. Then Margaret heard a voice that made her blood freeze. Samuel Brennan, riding behind the soldier lines, calling out over the gunfire. "I know you're in there. Margaret, this is your doing. Every death, every drop of blood. Come out now, and I'll call them off. Stay, and watch your savage friends die one by one." Rage filled her, hot and cleansing. This man who'd bought her like property, who'd sent armed men after a woman and child, who now brought death to people guilty only of showing mercy. He dared blame her. "Keep pressure here," she told Ayanna, then grabbed a rifle from a fallen warrior. She'd learned to shoot these past weeks. Karuk patiently teaching her despite some warriors' disapproval. Now she crawled to a gap in the rocks, sighted carefully, and fired. The shot struck near Brennan's horse, making it rear. She saw his face clearly, shocked that his purchased bride would dare shoot at him. "That's my answer," she shouted. "The only thing I'll give you is lead, same as any enemy." But bravado couldn't change reality. The Apache ammunition ran low. More warriors fell. The soldiers pressed closer, their superior numbers telling. Margaret could see the end approaching like a desert storm. Then Karuk was beside her, shoulder roughly bandaged, face set with determination. "We go now," he said. "You, me, Thomas, secret path through back canyon. I won't abandon—" "Not abandon. Nayland's orders." He gripped her shoulders. "Apache way. Some die so others live. Band scatters, regroups later. Warriors buy time for families to escape." Margaret saw it then. Women and children already disappearing into hidden paths. Elderly warriors taking positions to cover their retreat. This wasn't defeat but strategy. The Apache way of surviving against overwhelming odds. Chayton leads last defense. Karuk continued. His choice. His honor. Pain flickered across his face. Not physical, but emotional. He says, "Tell white woman she has Apache heart." Says protect it well. They moved quickly. Margaret carrying Thomas while Karuk led despite his wound. Behind them, the battle intensified as the remaining warriors sold their lives dearly. The secret path was narrow, winding between towering rocks, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Others fled with them, Ayanna and her young daughter, 2 elderly couples, a handful of women with children. They climbed in desperate silence, the sounds of battle growing distant but never distant enough. By nightfall, they'd reached a high plateau where 3 other escape groups converged, perhaps 30 Apache in total, all that remained of a band once twice that size. Nayland was there, her ancient face etched with grief but unbroken. She'd lost warriors today, people she'd delivered as babies, but her spine remained straight. They couldn't rest long. The army would track them come dawn. As they prepared to move deeper into the mountains, a scout arrived with news that made Margaret's heart sink. "Soldiers make camp in canyon," he reported. "Put up flag of truce. White chief wants to talk." Brennan, still trying to reclaim his property through negotiation after violence failed? Karuk translated the rest. Brennan promised safe passage for any Apache who surrendered Margaret and her son. No prosecution, no reservations. Just give up the white woman. "We not give you up," Karuk said immediately. But Margaret saw the looks exchanged among the survivors. How could she ask them to keep dying for her? That night, she lay sleepless beside Thomas, staring at stars visible between pine branches. They'd climbed high enough to reach forest, but safety was an illusion. Come morning, the choice would be stark: keep running and dying, or sacrifice herself for those who'd shown her mercy. Karuk found her before dawn, moving stiffly from his wound. "You think too loud," he said, settling beside her. "Wake whole camp with your thinking." "You know what I have to do," Margaret whispered. "Know what you think you have to do, different thing." He studied her face in the dim light. "You believe you bring us death, but you bring us life too. Show us whites can see Apache as human. Give us hope things can change. Hope doesn't stop bullets." Karuk, no. But without hope, why stop bullets? Why not just walk into soldiers' guns? He touched her face gently. You think we fight only for you. We fight for right to be Apache, right to live free. You part of that now, but not all." Dawn brought the decision she'd dreaded. The band gathered to council, voices low but urgent. Some argued for surrendering Margaret, not from cruelty but from desperate practicality. Others, led by Nalin, insisted Apache honor meant protecting those who'd earned sanctuary. Then Ayanna stood, her usually quiet voice strong. "Margaret saved my cousin Nashota, taught our children letters and numbers so they can fight white man with his own weapons. She shoots at her own people for us." Ayanna looked around the circle. "If we give her up, we say Apache protection means nothing. We become what whites think we are, people without honor." The argument continued, but Margaret had heard enough. She stood, Thomas clinging to her hand, and spoke the words she'd practiced in broken Apache. "I go. My choice. Apache no die for me more." The reaction was immediate. Kuruk surged to his feet despite his wound. Nalin's voice cracked like a whip. Even those who'd argued for her surrender looked shaken. But Margaret held firm, continuing in English. "This man, Brennan, he won't stop. Not while I'm with you. But if I go back—" She swallowed hard. "If I go back, maybe I can make him leave you alone. I know things about his business, his crimes. I can bargain." It was partially true. She'd overheard enough in Brennan's house to know he wasn't always legal in his dealings. Whether it would be enough leverage, she didn't know. But she had to try. "You go back. He kill you," Kuruk said flatly. "Slow, maybe, but kill certain. Maybe, but Thomas lives. You live. The people live." She used the Apache term deliberately. That's worth any price. The council erupted again, but differently now. Warriors who'd wanted her gone now argued against her sacrifice. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. In offering to leave, she'd finally, fully become one of them. But before any decision could be reached, scouts burst into the camp, soldiers approaching from 2 directions. The army had found them, was closing the trap. There'd be no negotiations, no surrenders, only flight or death. "Sacred caves," Nalin commanded. "Old hiding place, soldiers never find." They ran again, exhaustion forgotten in the face of survival. Kuruk led despite his wound, knowing paths through forests that seemed invisible. Margaret carried Thomas when he tired, her own strength fueled by desperation. Behind them, they could hear pursuit, soldiers crashing through undergrowth, dogs baying. The sacred caves were still miles away. Some of the elderly were falling behind, and the warriors who stopped to help them might not catch up. Then the forest opened onto a ridge. Below, more soldiers waited. They were surrounded, the trap complete. Brennan had planned well, used his money and influence to coordinate a military operation against a handful of Apache families. Kuruk pulled Margaret behind a fallen log as the first shots rang out. This was the end. No secret paths, no hidden caves, nowhere left to run. Around them, the Apache took positions for a last stand. "I'm sorry," Kuruk said quietly. "Promised to protect you. Failed." "No," Margaret said fiercely. "You gave me freedom, gave me choice, gave me—" She touched his face. "Gave me love. That's not failure." He kissed her then, there in the midst of chaos. A farewell and a promise and a defiance all at once. When they parted, both knew what came next. They would fight. They would likely die. But they would die as themselves, Apache and adopted Apache, warrior and woman who'd chosen her own path. Margaret checked her rifle, held Thomas close, and prepared for the end. But she'd face it with dignity, with courage, with the Apache heart Chayton had recognized in her. Brennan might win, might reclaim his property, but he'd never again own her spirit. The attack began. Soldiers advancing from all sides, and Margaret Sullivan, no longer Brennan, never again property, raised her rifle and stood with her chosen people for what might be the last time. The soldiers paused their advance as riders approached from the east. Not military, but civilians. Margaret recognized several faces from Cedar Ridge, including Sheriff Watson and Judge Morrison. But it was the woman riding side saddle who made her heart skip. Mrs. Catherine Holloway, the schoolteacher who'd been one of the few to show her kindness after James died. "Hold your fire." "On," Judge Morrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of law. "By order of the Territorial Court, hold your fire." Brennan pushed through the soldiers, his face purple with rage. "What's the meaning of this? I have writs, agreements with the Army, and I have a court injunction." The judge interrupted, producing a document. "Based on testimony regarding your business practices, Mr. Brennan. Seems some of your financial dealings have caught up with you." Catherine Holloway dismounted, her proper Eastern dress incongruous in the forest battlefield. She walked directly to where Margaret crouched with Thomas, ignoring the weapons pointed at her from both sides. "Margaret?" she said softly. "I'm sorry it took us so long. When word reached town about what Samuel was doing, buying a wife, hunting her like an animal, some of us remembered we're supposed to be civilized people." Behind her, Sheriff Watson cleared his throat. "Ma'am, Mrs. Sullivan, we've been investigating Mr. Brennan's activities. Seems that $500 he paid for you came from funds embezzled from the Cattlemen's Association. Man's been cooking books for years." Brennan sputtered, but the sheriff continued. "Also found interesting papers in his safe. Bills of sale for Apache scalps. Paid to Mexican hunters. That's murder for hire in the territory, regardless of the victims." Margaret stood slowly, hardly daring to believe. Around her, Apache warriors maintained their positions, suspicious of this sudden reprieve. Karuk moved protectively closer, his hand still on his weapon. "What are you saying?" Margaret asked. Judge Morrison spoke up. "What we're saying, Mrs. Sullivan, and it is Sullivan, as no legal marriage can be founded on fraud and coercion, is that you're free, Mr. Brennan will be returning with us to face charges, multiple charges." "This is preposterous," Brennan roared. "She's my wife." You paid with stolen money for a human being," Catherine interrupted sharply. "That's not marriage, Samuel, that's slavery, and we fought a war to end that." The standoff stretched taut. Soldiers looked to their captain, who looked to the judge. Apache fingers remained on triggers. Then Thomas broke free from Margaret's grip and ran to Catherine, whom he remembered from her visits after his father's death. "Mrs. Holloway, are we going home?" The teacher knelt to embrace him, tears in her eyes. "You're already home. Sweetheart, your mother found you a good home." That broke the spell. The captain ordered his men to lower weapons. Apache warriors gradually did the same, though watchfully. Brennan, seeing his support evaporate, made one last desperate play. "She's been living with savages, sharing their ways. No decent man would buy a wife," Margaret said, finding her voice at last. "No decent man would hunt a woman and child through the desert. No decent Christian would pay for Apache scalps." She stepped forward, Karuk beside her. "Yes, I chose to live with the Apache. They showed me more humanity than you ever did." Sheriff Watson moved to arrest Brennan, but the rancher pulled a hidden derringer. Before he could aim, 3 shots rang out. Margaret's rifle, Karuk's, and Catherine's small pistol all firing as one. Brennan crumpled, the gun falling from his hand. "Self-defense," Judge Morrison said calmly. Everyone saw it. Man pulled a weapon in the presence of law enforcement and civilians. As the sheriff checked Brennan's body, Catherine approached Margaret. "You don't have to come back to Cedar Ridge, but you could. Some of us, we've been wrong. About the Apache, about many things. Maybe it's time for changes." Margaret looked at Karuk, at Nalin, at the surviving Apache who'd become her family. Then she looked at Thomas, who deserved a future free from running. "I need to speak with my people," she said, using the Apache term naturally. The council that night was unlike any before. Nalin spoke of old times when Apache and some whites traded in peace. Ayanna, translated as warriors, debated whether trust was possible. Karuk sat silent, knowing Margaret's choice would shape his own. "You go back," Nalin finally said through Ayanna. "You build bridge, maybe. Teach white children Apache are people. Teach Apache children white words for defending themselves in white world. Not surrender, strategy." Margaret understood. Returned to Cedar Ridge not as Brennan's escaped property, but as a voice for understanding. It wouldn't be easy. Many would still see her as the woman who ran into Apache arms. But with allies like Catherine and the judge, perhaps change was possible. "Would you come?" she asked Kuruk quietly. "To Cedar Ridge? Try to live in both worlds?" His scarred face was thoughtful. "Apache need friends in White World, need voices to speak for us. Maybe I learn to walk your path, as you learned mine." Dawn brought farewells. Many Apache would continue deeper into Mexico, away from army reach, but some, including Nalan and Ayana, would remain near Cedar Ridge, attempting the delicate work of coexistence. Treaties would be negotiated, land would be argued over, trust would be built slowly. Margaret stood with Thomas at the forest edge, looking back at the camp that had become home. She wore Apache dress, carried Apache teachings, bore an Apache heart, but she also carried responsibility to build bridges, to prove that understanding was possible. "Ready?" Kuruk asked, adjusting the rifle across his shoulder. He'd agreed to serve as a scout and translator, jobs that would let him move between worlds. "No," Margaret admitted, "but readiness isn't required, just courage." Catherine waited with the wagon that would carry them back to Cedar Ridge. The town would gossip, would judge, would test them. But Margaret had survived Brennan's bed, Apache trials, and military pursuit. She could survive narrow minds and wagging tongues. As they descended toward the valley, Thomas chattering excitedly about seeing his old friends while wearing his Apache necklace. Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her here. She'd fled one life only to find another. She'd run from ownership into freedom, from isolation into community, from despair into love. "He paid for a bride," she murmured, "but I ran into Apache arms instead." Kuruk smiled, understanding. "Good trade," he said simply. Behind them, the rising sun painted the mountains gold, Apache gold, desert gold, the gold of new possibilities. Ahead lay Cedar Ridge with all its challenges. But Margaret Sullivan walked toward it with her son, her chosen partner, and her earned family, carrying lessons from both worlds. She'd been property, refugee, captive, warrior. Now she would be something harder, a bridge between peoples, a voice for understanding, a woman who'd chosen her own path and would help others find theirs. The territory would remember her story in different ways. Some would call it scandal, others tragedy, still others romance. But for those who'd lived it, Apache and white alike, it was simpler, a story of choosing humanity over hatred, courage over comfort, love over law. And in the end, that choice made all the difference. The rancher had paid for a bride, but what he'd purchased was transformation, his own destruction and her liberation. In running to Apache arms, Margaret had found not captivity but freedom, not savagery but civilization of a different kind. The wagon rolled toward Cedar Ridge, toward an uncertain future. But Margaret faced it with Apache courage and immigrant determination, with a mother's love and a woman's strength. Whatever came next, she would meet it as herself, no longer property, no longer running. Finally and forever free. In the desert behind them, an eagle circled, crying its wild song to the morning. Margaret smiled, understanding its message. Some spirits were never meant to be caged. They were meant to soar, to choose their own sky, to fly free regardless of who claimed to own the air. She'd run into Apache arms and found her wings. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. If you enjoyed Margaret's journey from purchased bride to freedom, please let us know where you're listening from. We love connecting with our audience around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. What did you think of Margaret's choice? Would you have run into Apache arms? Your stories and perspectives make our community richer. Until next time, keep riding free on the trails of imagination.